Raymond has an extension and research appointment with the Department of Entomology at Kansas State University. And his research and extension program involves plant protections and pest management in greenhouses, nurseries, landscapes, turfgrass, conservatories, and interiorscapes. Christmas trees, vegetables, fruits, cannabis, hemp, and pollinators. He's published over 90 scientific referred publications, over 900 trade journals, and over 60 extension publications on related topics to pest management and plant protection. Sorry for the jumble of words.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. I would rather have been there in person. I would have drove, but the weather might not have been conducive. So I'm doing this via Zoom, and the title of my presentation is Insect and Mite Management in Vegetable Production Systems. So I want to get going so we have some time for questions at the very end. So that's what I look like. That is not a green screen, that is Venice. And if you go over to the pane on the right, this is where the Rialto Bridge would have been. So I do recommend Venice. It should be on your bucket list. Very beautiful place to visit. So what can you expect from my presentation this afternoon? I'm going to cover the insect and mite pests and vegetable crop production systems. And then I'm going to focus in on the last part on the plant protection, also called pest management strategies. And then there should be enough time for question and discussion at the very end, or you'll be able to contact me via email. So, the vegetable production systems in the Midwest are going to be either field-grown production system on the left or hoop house production systems on the right. In the Midwest Kansas, we have both of these production systems, and I do think you have those also in South Dakota. Okay, so what are the common insect and mite pest vegetable production systems? Now, we have three groups. We have chewers, suckers, and borers. Chewers include caterpillars. That includes the porty cabbage worm, corn earworm, cutworms, hornworms, and cabbage looper. And then beetles, Colorado potato beetles, spotted cucumber beetle, flea beetle, striped cucumber beetle, bean leaf beetle, and blister beetles. And then we also have grasshoppers. I'm sure you have grasshoppers there in South Dakota. Then we have sucking insects, or insects that feed in the vascular tissues, and that includes aphids, spider mites, squash bug, leaf hoppers. Now, spider mites are not insects, but they are mites. Leaf hoppers, stink bugs, whiteflies, and thrips. And then we have a series of insects that actually tunnel into plant tissues. And the common ones include squash vine borer and European corn borer. Okay? So chewers, suckers, and borers. And that's important to understand because the damage that they cause to plants is going to vary among all three of these we call feeding behaviors or feeding guilds. So let's start back and talk about insect development. Well, there's a term called metamorphosis, which is we call a change in form, and there are two types. Incomplete or gradual, also called hemimetabolous, and then complete, also called holometabolous. And I'll explain the importance as we proceed through the presentation. You'll hear me use the term N-star. N-star is the stage between each molt. For example, certain insects like the infamous squash bug has 5 nymphal instars. The nymphs get bigger and bigger as they transition closer to the adult stage. Okay? So let's go over the types of metamorphosis. So on the left is holometabolous, or complete metamorphosis, where we have an egg, a larva, and a pupa, and adult. In most cases, the larva is the herbivore, feeds on plant material, whereas the adult moth or butterfly does not. So the damaging life stage is going to be the larva. Now, some instances will cover the adults also will cause the damage, but most of it's going to be caused by the larva. On the right is the hemimetabolous type of metamorphosis, also called gradual or incomplete, where we have nymphs, and this is the first N-star, second N-star. So the nymphs look like the adults, except they do not have wings, so nymphs cannot fly. But what's important to understand about this is both the nymphs and the adults cause plant damage, and in cases, most cases, they might be present simultaneously. Squash bug, for example, in October, we will find nymphs and adults feeding on pumpkin, okay? So it's important to understand that there are these two types of metamorphosis based on plant damage, and also when we talk about management. So, here we have complete metamorphosis in the larval stage here, and then you have the adult. In some cases, the larva causes damage where the adults do not, or the opposite, where the adults cause damage and the larvae do not. In incomplete metamorphosis, in most cases, both the nymphs and the adults are responsible for causing plant damage. And I think examples, we'll talk about examples of insects and mice that undergo each of these types of metamorphosis. And here they are. The insect pests that undergo complete metamorphosis are caterpillars and beetles. I'm not going to go over this list because you can read it, but caterpillars and beetles undergo complete metamorphosis. Okay? And as we proceed through the presentation, I'll provide examples of these. Insects that undergo incomplete metamorphosis include grasshoppers, aphids, spider mites, squash bug, leafhopper, stink bugs, and tarnished or lygus bugs. Okay? So, what should you consider when identifying insect and mite pests and determining the extent of potential plant damage? Number one is, what is the seasonality of the insect or mite pest activity? Are they present early, mid, or late in the season? Because some insects will come out early, some will come out moderately in the middle of the season, some will be present later, depending on plant growth stage. What are the host plants insect and mite pests feed? Some insects are polyphagous, meaning that they feed on a wide diversity of plants. Others are very specialist. They'll only feed on one type of plant or plants in one family. And then what are the damaging life stages? And this goes back to why I was wanting to talk about the different types of metamorphosis, is that based on the metamorphosis, that'll indicate what life stages are going to be problematic. In some cases, it'll be the larva and or adults, or just one of these life stages, okay? And the last one is, what is the mobility or ability of insect pests to disperse, that is, move around in a vegetable crop production system? And of course, most of the time the adults have wings, so they're more mobile than the larva or the nymphs. So what are some of the questions you need to answer associated with insect and mite pests? First of all, what is the life cycle? That is from egg to adult. How many generations are there per year? What is the feeding damage? How do they overwinter? And then do they transmit diseases? Okay? So let's talk about life cycle. So this is a squash bug, and the squash bug has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nymphal instars before they transition to an adult. All the life stages are above ground. There's no below ground life stage. Okay? And the life cycle from egg to adult will vary depending on the ambient air temperature during the season. Then we have spotted and striped cucumber beetle life cycles. Now, they have a larval stage in the ground that feeds on the roots, but the primary damage to vegetable crops is going to be due to the adults. Okay? So in this case, we have the complete metamorphosis, but the larva doesn't do much damage feeding on the roots. It's the adults that do, and also they transmit diseases. So insects are cold-blooded. So the number of generations, as you can see at the top here, will vary depending on the insect. Striped cucumber beetle has 1 generation per year, whereas aphids may have 12 generations per year. But then overwintering, insects cannot grow, and I know it's colder in South Dakota than it is here in Kansas, and they will overwinter as various life stages as adults, eggs, pupa, or larvae. Okay, so I just want to cover a little bit about overwintering life stages and why that's important to understand. So these are the overwintering life stages of insect and mite pests and vegetable crops. And the first ones, they overwinter as adults. Well, why is that important? Because the adults will come out earlier in the season because they're very hungry. They've used up all the metabolism. So if you plant early, then you run the risk of damage by the adults, by the insects that overwinter as adults. Some of them over in pupa or even eggs. In those cases, they'll come in later on in the season before they become adults. Okay? And so what's important to understand about this is when we talk about planting time, if you want to minimize problems with the insects that overwinter as adults, then you want to delay your planting time so your plants you put in the spring are not going to succumb to the adult stages of these various insect pests. Got that? Okay. So, It is important to know when insect and mite pests are active during the growing season, and of course, that's based on seasonality of pest problems. So that'll vary. So here on the y-axis is the number of individuals, on the x-axis is time, and you can see different dates. Now, the seasonality of an insect pest is primarily influenced by temperature, plant availability, and the plant growth stage. Okay? Got that? So temperature, plant availability, and plant growth stage will impact seasonality. Let me give you 2 examples. So, corn earworm is going to be present when the corn is basically out, because they're going to feed on the termites. Cutworm is going to be out early in the season because it feeds on the newly emerging seedlings. As you know, girdles them and they fall over. So the cutworm is going to be present. The cutworm will be present early in the season, whereas the corn earworm will be present later on in the season based on the plant growth stage. The young seedlings, you'll be having cutworm when the corn is got corn cobs on it, or it's fruiting or whatever it's got on it, basically. When corn is present, then you're going to have issues with corn earworm. Okay? So there's that seasonality that I was mentioning previously. So just to give you some examples of insects, this is the important cabbage worm. There's the larval stage. That's the pupa, and that's the adults. If you see these white moths floating around, the females have 2 black spots, the males only have 1. This is young and old cabbage loopers. This is probably first end star. This is probably a 4th or 5th end star larva. They feed primarily on plants in the brassica family, kale, cabbage, those types, and this is the damage they can do. They are chewing insects and voracious feeders, and if they go unchecked, this is the type of damage you'll see on collards or any plants in the Brassicaceae. They are specialists feeding on one family of plants. So here is tobacco hornworm, because it has the red horn. If it's black, it's tomato hornworm. And again, this is kind of a specialist feeder. It tends to feed on plants in the Solanaceae family, pepper and tomato. Okay, primarily more than anything else. So this would be considered a specialist caterpillar feeder. And again, corn earworm is also a specialist, feeding primarily on corn, although it will feed on other vegetable crops, but it's primarily a pest of corn, especially later on in the season when you're getting close to harvesting the corn off the plants. Okay, now let's talk about some beetles. On the left is the striped cucumber beetle, and I do apologize. Several images are those of insects having sex or copulating, and the reason is because they're easy to take pictures of. So this is not insect pornography, but the striped cucumber beetle and its cousin, the spotted cucumber beetle, not only do they cause direct damage to the plants, but they vector bacterial wilt to cucumber. It resides in their gut, and when they feed, the wounds and the feces that they lay transmit the diseases to plants. Okay, so there are some insects we will discuss that not only cause direct plant damage, but also indirect damage by vectoring either a bacteria, a fungi, or a virus. And again, remember, the larval stage is in the soil, the adults are feeding above ground. So here, again, and remember, the overwinter is adults. So they're going to come out early on. So here is some cucumber plants. There are the striped cucumber beetle, and there's the damage they cause early in the season. Okay, and that's really important because that's when the plants are most susceptible, not only to the direct damage, but also susceptible to the bacterial wilt. Then later on, this is a lovely pumpkin flower, then you see spotted cucumber beetles come in because they don't overwinter in the Midwest. But they come in and they start feeding on the flowers. These are insects highly attracted to an odor called cucurbitacin. And that will be important when we talk about monitoring. As the flowers bloom, they give off an odor that attracts both striped and spotted cucumber beetle. The other one we deal with is Colorado potato beetle. This is the adult. This is also a specialist feeder, primarily plants in the Solanaceae, potato, a little bit tomato, and a little bit of pepper. There's the larval stage. This is a 5th end star larva. They're gray and they have black spots on both sides of their body. And there are the early instar larvae. They're kind of orange-red initially, feeding on potato, and then later on, they'll develop that grayish tinge. But again, they feed primarily in plants in the Solanaceae family. Then we have flea beetles. This is the adult flea beetle, and one of their favorite hosts is eggplant. Again, they also feed on plants in the Solanaceae family, but in my experience in working with producers, it's eggplant. Eggplant, they love it, and you can see them all over the eggplant. And again, this is the damage. The larval stage is in the soil, but doesn't cause damage. It's primarily the adults. And here is the damage caused by flea beetles, and I'm sure many of you recognize this type of damage. So now let's talk about the insects that are feeding in the vascular tissues, which is the phloem and the xylem, the food-conducting and water-conducting tissues. And the main one is aphids. The aphids are on leaf undersides here on lettuce. And aphids are the only insects with tubes on their butt or abdomen called cornicles. And that's where they emit pheromones that will alert other members or conspecifics in the population to move off a plant, or that's how they communicate with each other. Aphids are generalist feeders. They feed on a wide diversity of plants, but more importantly is they vector viruses. They can vector over 300 plant viruses to vegetable crops. Another one is stink bug. There are various colors, the brown stink bug and the green stink bug. This is the brown stink bug feeding on tomato. And we don't normally have problems with stink bugs until the plants are in fruit. And normally here, we were dealing with tomatoes. These spotting you see here is when they puncture the plant, the tomato skin, they release a saliva, and that causes these distinct pimples on the tomato fruit. Then squash bug, the state insect of Kansas, well, the Midwest. But here we have the adult. The eggs are laid on the leaf underside. These are the 5th instar nymphs on the right, and this is the damage they cause to cucumbers, zucchini, squash, not so much watermelon, but mostly cucumber squash. So here are the early instars. This is probably the second instar that just eclosed, emerged from the eggs, and these are the 5th instars. You can see a couple of second instars there. So they initially have a black head and thorax, green abdomen, and then they develop that grayish color before becoming an adult. And again, this is the example of incomplete metamorphosis. Okay, now mites. Spider mites are not insects. They primarily feed in the chlorophyll contents of the plant. This is the male, female, these round structures are eggs, and you'll see webbing on the leaf underside. Okay, so their damage is going to look very different from insects that are feeding in the vascular tissues. And this is damage you'll see on tomatoes, which you've probably seen. They are very generalist, but they love to feed on tomatoes and hoop houses. They feed on watermelon outdoors, squash and zucchini. A wide diversity of vegetable crops. This is the damage they cause the cucumber. You can see you get sort of a chlorotic look, necrosis, and you'll be seeing webbing on leaf undersides. Okay? So this is damage caused by 2-spotted spider mite. They primarily feed on the older growth first, and then start moving up the plant. Okay, so with that introduction, we talked about phase 1, that is the insects and mites, the metamorphosis, overwintering, life cycles. Always important to understand, we're now going to talk about pest management. And I thought I'd just put these 2 publications up there. So let's cover plant protection strategies. Scouting, that's monitoring pest populations. Cultural, sanitation, removing weeds and plant debris. Mechanical, physical removal or use of barriers. Trap cropping, mass trapping, pesticides. I'm not going to get too much into details because of time, but I'd be happy to address any questions related to that. And then biological, that is the use of beneficial insects and mites, or often called biological control agents or natural enemies. Okay? So, scouting, how many out there scout? If you're not scouting, you're almost going down the road with blinders on. scouting is really critical to understand the trends in the population, like seasonality. That's why I mentioned earlier on, seasonality, how good or effective your pest management strategy is working. There are many reasons for scouting. And this publication from MSU is extremely valuable and talks about that. So one of the ways we scout is the beat method. This is in one of our tomato production facilities, and we just have a white piece of paper on a clipboard. We shake the branches, and we're looking for mites or thrips or whiteflies, any of the aphids. We're not counting them. We're just seeing how many are there, and whether we need to implement some type of plant protection strategy, or if the thresholds are low, we don't have to do anything. Okay? And I'll come back to this when I talk about our biocontrol program in hoop house tomato. Got that? Okay. So one thing I recommend, one item I recommend, very important tool, is a 10 or 16 inch hand lens, power hand lens, that will allow you to see insect pests on the underside of leaves. Remember, most of the soft-bodied insects and mites are on leaf undersides. You know why? They're very susceptible to ultraviolet light sunlight, and they'll burn up. So that's why many of your soft-bodied insects or mites reside on leaf undersides. Okay? Or when you tap the branches or leaves over a white sheet of paper, that will also allow you to see them more clearly. I carry one in my pocket. It's almost like the American Express card. I don't leave home without. So another form of monitoring are traps, or sticky traps. This is a Farrakhan insect monitoring kit, and in there is this sticky trap. And what you need to buy is a lure. This is for cucumber beetles. It's a lure. It's a cucurbitacea lure that is attracted to the adults of both striped cucumber beetle and spotted cucumber beetle. So this is in one of our projects. These are stakes, and these are the sticky traps, and on them are the baits, or the lure. This is in one of our zucchini squash plots. And this is the lure. So this is the trap. It's a sticky adhesive. You place the cucumber lure on it, and the odors, when they're given off, will attract the adult life stages of both striped and spotted cucumber beetle. And there they are. I think both of these are striped cucumber beetle, but it will also attract spotted cucumber beetle. So last year, we just started doing this, and we were very successful in capturing the adults of both striped and spotted cucumber beetle. Another means of monitoring, especially for caterpillar the adults, the moths, are light traps. And these are European corn borer, female and males, and these will allow you to detect when adults are present in the area, okay? And that's an early detection device, in this case for European corn borer. But you can use it for even corn earworm adults to give you kind of a heads up when the larva caterpillars might be present in the corn. So another important plant protection strategy is minimizing or avoiding weeds in plant production areas. And that's easier said than done, I realize. But I think it's important to stress why weed management is critical. It's important to remove or minimize the presence of weeds because many weeds can harbor insect pests and certain viruses that are vectored and spread by insect pests. Many weeds out there will harbor the viruses that are consequently vectored by whiteflies, leafhoppers, or aphids. Okay, all those are sucking insects. So many broadleaf weeds are susceptible to and serve as a refuge for insect pests such as aphids, thrips, and leafhoppers. Again, weeds may also serve as overwintering sites for certain insect and mite pests. For example, two-spotted spider mite overwinters on weeds in a field. So weed management, along with disease management and insect management, is a really important component of plant protection. So this is a weed in the field, and it's not cannabis, it's a relative, but you can see all these aphids on that weed, and when that weed starts to desiccate, they will move on to the main crop. So not only would you get direct damage from the aphids, but you run the possibility of viruses vectored by these aphids And of course, there are no viricides, and that could reduce the yields of your crop. So here's a publication, Weeds, Shelter, Vegetable Insect Pests, and these are aphids, I believe, on a Malvaceae weed. And you can just see that the weed is harboring the aphids. This is a really good publication, which I do recommend you download. It was 1971, entitled Role of Weeds in the Incidence of Virus Diseases. James Doofus was a sugar beet breeder in Salinas, California, which is where near where I'm from. I'm from Carmel Valley, which is on the other side of the mountain. And it's a good, easy to read information on how aphids and weeds are associated, and the viruses that weeds vector to plants. So I do, if you can get a hold of this, download it. I do recommend it as good reading. If you're having trouble sleeping, it will definitely cure that. And here's another example. Summer weeds is host for Frankliniella occidentalis, that's western flower thrips, and Frankliniella fusca, that's tobacco thrips, and as reservoirs for tomato spider wheelbarrows. So again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. The weeds not only will serve as a refuge for the insect pest, but also serve as a refuge or reservoir for the viruses that they transmit. So that is why weed management is critical in minimizing problems in vegetable crop production systems. So what about trap plants? Trap plants such as the sunflower placed around some vegetables. Trap plants are plants that are attractive to insect pests and retain them in the area so they don't move on to the main crop. Now, the trap plants have to be more attractive to them than the main crop, or it won't work. Okay? So I'm sure you've heard of the use of blue Hubbard squash to serve as a trap plant for your cash crop. Okay? So when the insects get on these plants, you have two options. Spray them and kill them, or pull them out and dispose of the plants with the insects, which means you got to go back and replant with the trap plant. Okay? So here's a publication entitled Using Trap Crops for Control of Academia mitata, that's the striped cucumber beetle, reduces insecticide use of veteran squash. Okay? So they're using blue Hubbard squash to serve as a trap plant, like here, to keep the striped cucumber beetles in the area so they don't move on to the main cash crop. Okay? So trap cropping in vegetable production systems, it's important that the trap crops can be planted around the field perimeters or interplanted with cash crop. A trap crop's effectiveness depends on what pests you are trying to manage and how desirable the host is for those pests. And that's why it's important to understand, are you dealing with a specialist insect pest or a generalist insect pest? Because if you're dealing with a specialist insect pest, trap cropping may not work because they're going to be attracted more to the cash crop than they are to the trap crops. Okay? So this is a really good publication I recommend for reading that describes more about trap cropping in vegetable production systems. Now inside, if you're doing hoop house production, you can use yellow sticky tape and mass trap insects. Now these will only catch the flying life stages, the adults, but it is effective. In this case, we're using it in tomatoes to capture the moths before they lay eggs, and then you'll get some caterpillar pests, such as variegated cutworm, some of the other ones that might be a pest on tomatoes. You can also place it outdoors, if you can, so any insects that are going to migrate, they get captured and they don't come in. Okay? Now this obviously was when I was doing consulting in Central America, but I do believe it's an option that some of our growers in the Midwest are utilizing it. Maybe not to this extent, but they are using it on the windward side, where you have open areas to capture the leafhoppers, whiteflies, winged aphids, thrips, before they enter or they're captured so they don't enter the greenhouse or hoop house. What about reflective mulches? Reflective mulches are mulches that reflect light, and what this does, it confuses the insects. They can't find the plant, and consequently they don't land on it, feed on it, and more importantly, they don't transmit diseases. In this case, for aphids and thrips, they will not transmit viruses. And we have a number of growers that are using different types of reflective mulches, especially in the hoop houses. And it seems to be quite effective in reducing aphid and thrips populations and also whitefly populations during the growing season. You can get silver, I like silver, but also black or white. So here's a publication entitled Reflective Mulches Foil Insects out of California. You can see that they're actually using it in large-scale food productions. Again, the reflection of the light confuses the insects and they can't hone in or land on the actual plants. And then here's one. Mulches reduce aphid-borne viruses and whiteflies in cantaloupes in California, my home state. And again, they're using it in feed production systems to minimize those insects, primarily the vector viruses. Okay, what about floating row covers? Another barrier. Floating row covers are used primarily to keep the adult stages of moths from getting on plants laying eggs and restricting striped and cucumber beetles from getting in and feeding and then consequently transmitting the bacteria with the cucumber. Now, if the insects are overwintering below the plant, it's not going to work, okay? And that has happened with squash bugs in the last couple of years, is you have to remove the debris where the adult stages of squash bugs overwinter before you actually do this, okay? I'm sure many of you do this. It's a barrier, and remember you have to tuck the ends in about 4 inches because insects will crawl under it, and you have to get it on early in the season before the insects get on the plants. This material does allow sunlight, it does allow rain, but you do have to remove it to allow pollinators to pollinate your crops. Here's a nice publication called Floating Row Cover in Transparent Mulch to Reduce Insect Populations, Viral Diseases, and Increase Yield in Cantaloupe. So it is used in large-scale production and very effective. Okay. What about planting early or later in the growing season? This may mitigate problems with certain insect pests. This is where I talked about overwintering. If you plant early, then you run the risk of encountering the adult stages of those insects that overwinter as adults. But if you delay your planting in the season, you may minimize those early adult stages that come out feeding on your crops. So planting later will may be more beneficial than planting earlier in the crop production season to avoid or escape having your plants fed upon by the adult stages that come out from overwintering. Does that make sense? And we have a number of growers that do that, especially this like watermelon, the cucurbitaceans, because they want to avoid their crops suffering damage from the striped or spotted cucumber beetle. What about mulches? This is a straw mulch of potato, and mulches may reduce problems with certain insect pests. Widely used. Now, what mulches are primarily doing is they're providing a nice favorable habitat for ground beetles. Ground beetles and carabids are predaceous, both as larvae and adults, and the adults will come out and feed on Colorado potato beetle larvae on your potato plants. So here's a publication entitled Effects of Straw Mulch on Pests, Insects, Predators, and Weeds in Watermelons and Potatoes. But what's really important to understand is the mulch itself is not inhibiting insects. It's providing a favorable environment for natural enemies such as ground beetles to proliferate. Okay, so what about pesticides? This is a list of what I call selective alternative pesticides, not conventionals. Sulfur, soap, oils, kaolin clay, pyrethrin spinosad, azadirachtin, and their most selective material, caterpillars, ditel. Okay? This is actually an entire presentation. I don't have that luxury, but what I do want to get, the point I really want to get across is how to effectively use these. Timing. You want to apply your pesticides when the most susceptible life stages, and that is larvae, nymphs, and adults of any given insect or mite pest are present. The eggs are only killed by oils, and nothing kills the pupa. And then what's